the point of a contract is that, it's a legal document or, legally enforceable document, whatever you want to say, at like a high level view of it. But it is a written embodiment of what the relationship is between two or more parties, and says what happens regarding the relationship between the two parties. So the contract needs to say who does what, how you get paid, it's similar to the business plan where it's got all the information. Whatever kind of contract it is, it needs to detail everything that's supposed to be in there.
Welcome back to another edition of the Kronos Group Podcast. I am your host, Jerry Brazie, and I have a great guest with me today. Today we're talking to Matthew Fornaro, and he is a business law attorney. He's been working in small and medium-sized businesses in South Florida for over 20 years and started his career, like so many attorneys do, at the big prestigious law firms doing civil litigation. Then he made the jump to doing it on his own and working directly with business owners. He teaches and mentors entrepreneurs through programs like at Florida State and the Kauffman Foundation. So he's seen the same legal mistakes repeat themselves for decades. Today, we're going to talk about what happens when businesses get sued, what owners misunderstand about lawyers, and the legal decisions that quietly matter long before there's a problem, which is the key to finding some success in business. Matthew, I'm happy to have you on. Thanks for coming on the Kronos Group Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jerry. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. Let's start off with, before we get into the law side of things, people like to have some background on who they're talking to. So give us the 3-minute prior to you entering the workforce, doing what you're doing. Where'd you grow up? What's your background look like? The quick 3-minute version.
Yeah, no problem, Jerry. So I'm in Parkland, Florida right now. My office is in Coral Springs, right next door. I've been here since I was 6 years old. So I've been here for over 40 years. This is where I grew up. This is where my family is. This is my hood. So I went to undergrad at Florida Atlantic University. I went to law school at the University of Florida. I came out and did mostly general commercial litigation. I worked at 2 large AmLaw 200 law firms. About now 11 years ago, I decided, instead of going to an even bigger firm, to go out on my own, which I did. And I wanted to focus on helping small businesses, entrepreneurs, and startups, because I felt that they were underserved by bigger law firms and by like the law firms out here in the suburbs and stuff, because they're not really focused or attuned to helping that demographic. So that's under 3 minutes, and that's kind of what I've been doing the last 11 years.
Perfect. And I've had, as we said prior to starting recording, I'm coming up on 300 podcasts. I have had people who are attorneys but not necessarily practicing attorneys. So I've had attorneys on before. You are the first business attorney that I have had on, and that was on purpose. I have been a lifetime entrepreneur, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, and a dozen businesses. So my interaction with the law, with law firms and lawsuits and kind of that world is pretty extensive to anybody who has had that kind of experience. And so for a long time, I didn't want to interview or talk to lawyers simply because I have to deal with them so much. But as time has gone by and the podcast is where it is now, I think it's important for people to hear directly from attorneys, maybe through an intermediary like me that has so much experience with attorneys, that can give it some breadth to what the real world is relative to the law and business people and entrepreneurs and people running and operating businesses. So with that said, I thought that you were a perfect example for that, because you're on your own, which I think is critical. That's a big one. Mm-hmm. And also because you're serving the very demographic that I serve also, and that who listens to that. So with that being the case, let's start with a real simple question. Most common way small business owners get themselves into legal trouble, as you see. I'm looking for just a common thing. What's something that everybody, I'm going to go start a business. I'm up and running. I've got something to sell. I'm going to go do it. What's the one thing they don't do that they should?
Sure. So, by the way, Jerry, if it makes you feel better, I don't want to talk to attorneys either unless I have to. So, I deal with them too much myself. So the first,
So you get why I haven't had one on in a long time.
yeah, I
In a long
understand.
time.
Hopefully you will put me in your Hall of Fame, and we'll never need another one to come on.
Let's do it.
So the critical error, or if you want, or misstep that I see most common with businesses or entrepreneurs starting a business, or whatever you want to say, is that they are too quick to get into business and they don't do the necessary due diligence before they start their business. And it starts with, before you even start the business, right at the bottom, before you start building anything, you have to have a written business plan. And a lot of people just skip over that and jump into being in business. And the issue is that your written business plan is essential because it's the roadmap for your business. It tells you the who, what, when, where, why, and how about your business, what it's going to be about, what its goals are, what, how you're going to get money, how you're going to make money, how you're going to add people, how you're going to subtract people, you're going to rent property. If you're, like a commercial space, stuff like that, it's all in there. And it's necessary because it helps you focus on the actual real world practice and practicalities of starting a business before you start it. So the issue is that a lot of people just skip that step and, go online onto their state's Secretary of State website or whatever, register a business, and then they just get going and kind of figure it out or don't figure it out along the way. And that's probably, I would say, in all my experience, that's probably the biggest misstep or critical error that businesses first make when they start out, is they get into business too quick without doing the due diligence.
Yeah, and I think in the world today, particularly with access to AI and things of that nature, figuring out how to do that is much easier than it was, when I started out 25, 30 years ago. And this is a perfect example, I think, here. Most of the entrepreneurs that I know over that last 30 years, I don't know a very few that had, and we're talking about people who've been in business now 15, 20 years, that did exactly what you just described. So I'm not going to argue with you that that's reality, because that 100% is, and I wish I had. Mm-hmm. On the flip side of that, there is this disconnect between the entrepreneurial brain that says, go run in and I'll figure it out when I get there. Yeah. And the lawyer brain that says, no, you got to do this. And so I think that that's good advice that you're giving. And I think that if I could go back and I could do that again, I absolutely would. But there is a delta between being too careful, and maybe we're beyond the question I just asked you, because that's very fundamental and you're 100% right there. But being too careful, right? Dotting every I, crossing every T. I guess if I listened to my attorneys, I wouldn't be sitting here and wouldn't have done all of the things that I've done. The flip side to it is, if had I listened to my attorneys, I probably would have not lost fortunes over my career and wouldn't have had to made so many. So there is that give and take when you're dealing with an attorney from the business owner side, that you have to weigh that information and then make a decision from that. There's almost by nature, attorneys are conservative in that context.
No, it's true. I mean, obviously, if you have a aggressive attorney who's telling you to undergo liberal business practices, you may not have the right attorney. In the long run, maybe in the short run, but no, it's just by habit and by practice, by training, by observation, whatever. I mean, attorneys are just want to err on the side of caution when they advise their clients, particularly in the business sector when they're starting up, to just make sure that they're proactive and they plan properly and prepare properly before they start doing stuff, if they can.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. And the other thing too, and I'd love to get your feedback, as you were a young attorney at one point, and now you're a more experienced attorney, we'll call it. I think it's like losing weight, right? You don't want to go get a fat trainer because you want to go, you want somebody to train you that's been there and has done that and has some experience. And so I think that in my experience, having an attorney who has actual experience, who has been out there, is not fresh out of school. Maybe he's, seen some more, started his own firm, built that up, had some context. I think you guys probably have an advantage. And if I were giving advice about attorneys, which I have on many occasions, it's always to go find somebody with experience, because there's a fine line between letter of the law and implementation, and what you can or should do.
No, I agree. I mean, there's a total difference between, knowing conceptually what the law says versus how real world business practices play out with entrepreneurs, startups, even ongoing businesses. So for instance, 11 years ago, before I started my own business, I mean, I represented like big corporations and stuff, whatever, but I mean, it was very more cerebral and theoretical what I was doing, because like I didn't actually know what it takes to, do your taxes every year, or, from a business standpoint, or register your corporation online and make sure it's there, and get liability insurance, and pay rent, and, have W-2 or 1099, employees or independent contractors, and have to deal with like, phone systems and internet service providers and legal research platforms, and, contracts that you have to review for part of your business or whatever. So, I mean, yeah, there's a big difference between having the theoretical legal knowledge of like, okay, this is a contract or whatever, versus like, I've seen what happens with contracts like this from a business owner or someone who runs a business's standpoint. So yeah, I think, it's not just me speaking for myself, but I think for anyone, it's essential of, like you just said, you don't want a fat personal trainer. It's the same thing. If you want a business law attorney, you should have an attorney who not necessarily, I mean, doesn't have to have a home firm or something like that, but needs to have practical business knowledge outside of the law in order to better, not just, a counselor at law versus attorney at law. So to counsel you for making good business decisions and smart and informed business decisions, it helps to have someone who actually has made business decisions themselves and understands the ramification of business decisions versus just application of legal theory.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly said. You want somebody who has signed the front of a check and has that experience to go along with it. In that context, then, for a new entrepreneur, let's just talk basically, let's say about a contract. If you have a contract, what do business owners miss about what contracts actually do versus what they don't do? What do they miss? What do they think that a contract is, and what do they miss that in reality it won't protect them?
Sure. So, Jerry, one of the biggest things is, before we even get to having a contract, a lot of people don't have contracts, which is half the problem right there, because the point of a contract is that, it's a legal document, or, legally enforceable document, whatever you want to say, at like a high level view of it. But it is a written embodiment of what the relationship is between two or more parties, and says what happens regarding the relationship between the two parties. So the contract needs to say who does what, how you get paid, it's similar to the business plan where it's got all the information in it. The contract also should have all the information for the relationship between your business and the other business, your business and your employee, your business and your landlord, whatever kind of contract it is. It needs to detail everything that's supposed to be in there. It needs to say, what your requirements and responsibilities are, what the other side is responsible for, what is supposed to happen if there's a dispute, how the dispute gets resolved, how payments are made. All that stuff needs to be in a contract. So you can have a 1-page contract that's great, or you can have a 50-page contract that's terrible, because that information is missing from the contract somewhere, or it's in the contract. So, length of a contract really isn't an end all be all as to, is the contract good or not? It's, does it say what it needs to say regarding the relationship between or among the parties, and, does it have all the things in there? Like if there's a dispute, how it gets resolved, payment terms, it leaves nothing for chance. So all that information needs to be made in a contract. And like I said, it doesn't have to be an incredibly long contract. It can be a short contract, just as long as it's all in there. Because if it's not in there, then it doesn't exist. And if it doesn't exist, then you have to go figure out alternate theories and alternate ways to, prove really what our relationship was, how much you were supposed to pay me or how much I was supposed to pay you or how many, widgets you were supposed to deliver or things like that. And it causes all kinds of problems where if it's in a contract, we may have a dispute over the contract, but there's no doubt that you and I had a meeting of the minds and we had a contract that says, I pay you $100 a month. You give me 5 widgets on the 1st of every month and I pay you on the 5th of every month. That's pretty specific. And if one of us doesn't do one of those things, it's pretty specific what we didn't do. And then there should be a thing in there that says, if you don't do this, then this happens. So, that would be my overview of contracts, is that it's got to have everything that's going on in there, but it doesn't necessarily have to be lengthy. It just has to have the correct information in there.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. I had a CPA on yesterday. One of the biggest, it just comes up constantly, is entrepreneurs and their misunderstanding or lack of understanding when it comes to cash flow, right? We love revenue. We like profit next, and cash flow we worry about third, which obviously anybody running a business, that is clearly inverted, and cash flow is king and is the blood of an operation. And so it's like, do I have a CPA come on? He was really good, and we did some real practical world examples, and kind of the same thing about attorneys too, is because I know there's going to be people's eyes rolling back in their head when we're talking about contracts, and you need a contract out front. So in a real world example, having bid down the law, being sued, dozens of times over my 25 odd years, the difference between having a contract and spending that money out front, which is, I think, the number one reason why people don't do it, is they don't want to spend the money on the contract out front, and the money it will save you on the backside is significant. So from a pure investment perspective, you mark it up to the cost of customer acquisition. In your case, if we're selling something or buying something, or we have, some relationship with someone that we are forging, that contract, it's not going to save you from spending money in a lawsuit, but it can be the difference between winning and losing, and more specifically, spending less money to try to bring it home, to kind of give it a real world practical example.
Oh, that's true. A lot of issues. I mean, look, you just identified a major issue. If you're in business long enough, no matter how great a business person you are, no matter how great your contracts are, no matter how much, preventative measures you take or whatever, eventually you're probably going to get involved in a lawsuit, whether right or wrong, because that's just the nature of business. It's going to happen. So if you want to make sure that you have the best materials possible to work with, and that starts with the contract. And obviously, it goes all the way back to when I started talking about the written business plan. One of the things as a business owner or entrepreneur that you need to understand is that as part of your budget or part of your plan or whatever it is, you have to put in there that you need to have things like an accountant do your taxes, consult with a business law attorney, consult with a banker, because it is a group of professionals who are there to help you to avoid issues down the road. Mm-hmm. And if you get into those issues down the road, interacting with those professionals will mitigate the damage from being involved in those disputes down the road. And that's, kind of goes back to, I guess, what your guest was talking about yesterday, is that, you want to make sure that you're prepared, and ready as possible so that you can make, like I was saying before, good business decisions and not have to worry about making legal decisions, accounting decisions, whatever, so that, you can go worry about the actual, workings of your business rather than worrying about, well, my contract is terrible, I'm going to get in trouble or something like that.
Yeah, where I've seen that really play out for me, and I encourage the people that I work with not to do this, is in partnerships. I'm of the opinion, having had a partner in my early part of my career, that everything's all good and it's comfortable and you feel good about it until money gets made. When everyone's struggling, it's easy to have a partnership. When money gets made, Now it's, I do more work than he does, and he took more days off than I do, and you get all of those things. And so I have seen that fall apart more times than I have seen it work in a partnership environment. And when they split the contract that they put together at the beginning, if it was a handshake agreement between a couple of buddies over a beer, that thing's going to get ugly. If there's a contract written up with the detail that you're talking about and some time was put into it, it doesn't mean that split won't be ugly. It just means it'll be less ugly.
No, it's true. I mean, obviously a large, I do a lot of litigation, so a large part of my practice are, business divorces. It's just a general term for, when businesses implode, explode, whatever you want to call it. So, for corporations, LLCs or whatever, when you have people in business together, not necessarily partners, but business affiliates, or if it's a partnership, true partners, nobody goes into business saying that I want to hate the guy who I'm in business with, or I'm going to get in a dispute with the guy that I'm in business with. They always go in business because they're optimistic, they want to make money or whatever. But the reality is that just like there's a high percentage of, marital divorces, there's a high percentage of business divorces too, where people just don't want to be in business together anymore, whether it's because they're making too much money and, whatever, or they're making too little money, or all of a sudden they wake up one day and I don't like you anymore, or you wake up and you don't like me, or I want to go do something else and I want to get out of this business. So if you don't have, just like going back to the written business plan, if you don't have the next step in that process of governing documents for your business once you start your business, whether it's a corporation, LLC, or partnership, you're going to have problems. Because if you have no contract, then, like, for instance, I'm in Florida, so we're going to have to go look at the Florida LLC code or the Florida corporations code, and that's going to interpret what our relationship was legally and who gets what and how we split it up and do whatever. And that's probably not what we were thinking, but that's what's going to happen because we didn't have it memorialized somewhere. Or if you have a crappy contract, it's going to be pretty much the same thing. Whatever's not covered in that contract is going to be filled in with what the default law says. And you may not like what the default law says because it'd be very punitive and very costly. Versus if you just had it in your agreement to begin with, it's just like any other contract. It says what's going to happen if we're going to break up. Here's the roadmap of how it's going to happen, how we go from step A to B to all the way to Z. And if there's any problems, here's how it's fixed, and here's who pays for what, and it's all contained. So, do we follow that plan? Sometimes people do, and they just go through the contract and they dissolve their LLC or their corporation, or they transfer out or whatever. Or sometimes, people file lawsuits. And then if you file a lawsuit, the court is going to look at what's the governing document say. And if it says, you do A to Z, then they do A to Z, and that's it. But if that's missing, like I said, you're going to have to fill in those holes, and you're not going to like what happens. And it's going to be much more time consuming and costly than if you would have preemptively just drafted a good document to begin with and had that in place.
Yeah, there's almost like an emotional block to people who start businesses, particularly partnerships, but anybody, that they're so excited about going out and doing this thing that they're putting together. And are we really going to do it? That it almost feels like you're trying to draft a prenup, right? Well, if you really love me, then why do we need a prenup? And if this is forever, why do we need these things? And everything is rosy and beautiful and it's going to work. And this is great. We're young and we're energetic. And it almost seems like we don't want to do that, get down and have those real adult conversations, I call them, that will save time, that will save just an immense amount over time. So I guess the message that I want people to hear, what you're saying, is how important this is. And just take that time out. Doesn't mean you hate each other. It doesn't mean anything other than you are protecting each other in the event that the thing that is going to inevitably happen, I think, because I think it happens a whole lot more than it doesn't, is memorialized, to your point, somewhere, and it makes that pain a little less painless. I agree. For the first time guy that is getting, well, I was baptized by fire. I was approached by a group. I was running a company in Portland for the owner. I was approached by a group in Portland, Oregon. I was 28 years old to come and start a business, and I was going to be the operating side of it and bring in all the business, and they were the financing. And I ran it up to $3 million in the first year, and they didn't have the money that they said they did. The little thing about cash flow got kicked in. That's where I learned how cash flow works, and they fired me. 17 days later, I went and started my own, and all of the customers that I had moved from company one that I had worked out for years to the new company, I then went and got and brought to my new company a year later. So they sued me, and I remember exactly. I'd never been sued before. I didn't really have a sense other than Perry Mason on television what that even meant. And they sued me, and I remember, I've told the story many times, I remember getting that lawsuit. I was sitting in a Kroger's parking lot, and I opened it up, and it's, an inch thick, and as I read it, I was like, this was from them, and this was their suit. And as I read it, I was like, oh, I'm guilty. I don't want to read this because I'm guilty. It's written in such a way that you're like, I'm guilty. And I called my attorney right away, and I was all new to attorneys. And I remember him saying, no, man, we're going to craft our response and just relax. And a few days later, the response comes out, and I get that response, and I'm like, those sons of bitches, right? They did it. I told you they did it. So there's this kind of idea of how these things work. And then there is the practical reality of how these things work. So for someone who is sued for the first time, what should they do short of calling their attorney in the first, few days, and kind of their perspective on that first lawsuit? I think there's everyone's going to freak out and think the world's ending. Give us some sense of reality there in those early days.
Sure. Well, the first thing is take it seriously, which, believe it or not, a lot of people don't, which I don't get, but have the correct mindset once you get hit with a lawsuit of it's a very serious matter. It's not the end of your life. Don't obsess over it, even though it's a huge issue and it's affecting you mentally or whatever. You have to try as best as possible to compartmentalize it and just think of it as part of the business process in your business, but you can't ignore it. You can't throw it, underneath the couch in the living room and hope it goes away or whatever. It's real and it's happening. So a lot of people don't take it seriously, believe it or not. And that's the first thing. The second thing is, submit it to your insurance company ASAP, because a lot of lawsuits, business lawsuits or whatever, if you have liability coverage, professional liability, certain things are covered by insurance, and people don't really think about that or are in that mindset when they're first served with a lawsuit. And then they go and they get an attorney, and then the attorney gets involved, and then they do a bunch of work, and then they figure out, oh, there's insurance coverage. And then guess what? You're not going to recoup that money that you had to pay that attorney once your insurance company comes in anyways. So my second thing I would say is see if there's insurance coverage before anything, but make sure, you do that ASAP and make sure there's a yes or no answer. If yes, then you got to meet. You have insurance defense counsel is going to come in and handle the case. If no, then you have to go, notify your attorney anyways once you get sued that you're, going to see if there's insurance coverage or not, so it goes on their radar. But if there's no insurance coverage, then your attorney's going to have to handle it. And then obviously make sure that your attorney actually does litigation and isn't just a transactional attorney, because that's going to turn out real bad for you. So make sure that if your business attorney doesn't do litigation, make sure that they refer you to an attorney who actually does litigation, not dabbles in litigation, but focuses on business law litigation. And, then you go from there. You're going to put together a defense to your lawsuit. You're going to put together maybe a counterclaim to your lawsuit, and you're going to put together a plan where you're going to work with the attorney. You're the business person. We're going to make good business decisions for your business. So maybe it's worth trying to settle this case earlier and conserve money, or maybe the other side is so far apart that it's just, we got no choice but to litigate. But you want to constantly have these conversations with your attorney the whole time, and you want to make sure that at every step of the way, as the business owner, the entrepreneur, the startup person, whatever, that you're making routine good business decisions at every step of being involved in a lawsuit. You don't want to get emotional. You don't want to get obsessed. even though I know it's easier said than done, because a lot of people are really weighs on their head. I mean, I've had clients where, I mean, they're beyond obsessed with being involved in a lawsuit. I mean, it's fanatical that they're involved in a lawsuit. And as easy as it is for me to say, you have to, like I said earlier, compartmentalize that and just remember it's part of the business process. It's an offshoot of being in business. It's going to happen probably at some point in your business career. So it's not, it may be personal if there's some animosity between you and your former partner or your former business affiliate or someone who you were in business with, but it's a business thing. So, at the end of the night, it's a fight over, not performing under a contract, not paying something, owing someone, whatever. You're going to, at the end of the night, if you lose the case or whatever, you're going to go home and you're going to be able to sleep in your bed at night. No one's going to come and take you away to jail or, something like that. So you always have to put in perspective that it's just a fight over money and assets and things like that. It's not over your liberty or your freedom. So, a lot of people have really weird misconceptions about lawsuits or whatever. So, you have to get in the right mindset and the mentality and then just address it and make sure, like I said, you're making good decisions throughout.
Yeah, that's a really good point that I think entrepreneurs should hear coming into it, that if you are running your own business, it's not if, it's when. And so the inevitable is going to happen, and you just have to look at it the same way you would all of the other slings and arrows and sacrifices that you make and risks that you take and the vagaries of running a business from a day to day. It's kind of built into that. And if you get your head around that before rather than after and treat it just like you said, with the importance it deserves, but don't obsess over it. I found it to be much easier. For me, it was a natural thing though, because it started so early on that first deal. And it was just, I learned early on what the realities of it were. And having said that, it brings me to my next question, which is when I had drivers for years and years and forever they were employees, and then they ended up being independent contractors. Long story short, as I flipped into independent contractors, a small attorney in the city sued me, got somebody to come with, one of my employees to come with, and said I didn't pay them correctly. And I was like, I know I paid you correctly. I ended up fighting that one out. This has been 20 years ago, 25 years ago. I ended up fighting that one out because I was right. And I spent, I don't know, $100,000 to prove that I was right. In the end, the judge saw it for me, but didn't give me fees. So I was out $100,000. So theoretically I won. I learned a very important lesson that day, which is I ended up getting a bunch of those from that same attorney. She just went and got more and more people to sign. And I don't know, probably averaged $12,000 to settle those things without having to prove that I was right. And ultimately those all went away. So a very important lesson I learned, the difference between a lawsuit that's annoying and one that might be an existential issue for a business. From your perspective, talk to me about, that's I guess a real world example. From your side, what's the difference between one or the other, an annoying lawsuit or an existential one?
Believe it or not, the lines are blurred between both because, there's a little bit of reality in almost all lawsuits. There's maybe a scintilla of reality, and there's always part existentialism in all lawsuits. So it's a mix of both. I mean, it goes back to making good business decisions. So, if you're the defendant in a lawsuit, you're in a money losing situation, no matter how well it turns out for you. Mm-hmm. It is a money losing situation because not only is it costing you money for attorney's fees and whatever damages you're going to be found or whatever, but it's taking time away from you focusing on your business making money. So you want to make the best possible smart business decision to extricate yourself from that lawsuit to cost you the least amount of money. So it doesn't matter if you're vindicated or not, or, you're right or you're wrong. What's going to cost you the least amount of time and money to get out of that lawsuit? Sometimes it's, pay some blood money and settle the case at some point in time, short of trial or whatever. Sometimes the plaintiff could be a maniac and doesn't want to settle and wants a preposterous amount of money for whatever. And sometimes you have to go to trial and, go all the way and maybe have an appeal or whatever. So, the nuisance lawsuit, the real lawsuit, it doesn't matter, like the different cliches. I mean, a rusty knife will kill you just as much as a regular knife. It's the same thing with the lawsuit. A frivolous lawsuit, unless defended correctly or whatever, can do as much damage as a legitimate lawsuit against you. So it's just a matter of, if you're the defendant, make good decisions to figure out how to extricate yourself out of that situation for as little time and money as possible. And if you're the plaintiff, make sure that you have realistic goals of what it is you want to accomplish with your lawsuit, and you'll be able to accomplish them. If someone owes you a bunch of money and they don't have any money, your lawsuit is going to be meaningless if you get a paper judgment, particularly in a state here like Florida, where we are, a debtor's paradise, where, people go hide out from judgment creditors all over the world in Florida. So if someone owes you, let's say, I'll just give you a hypothetical. Let's say someone owes you $100,000. Okay. And, if you go through all the steps and you sue them and you go to trial and you win a trial, whatever, you get the right to try to collect $100,000 from them. And in a place like Florida, it's hard to collect $100,000 from a business that's, smart and does things with their assets, and an individual that's smart and does things with their assets. However, let's say during the course of that lawsuit or whatever, the person offers you, $50,000 to go away. All right. There's something to be said where you're in, just like when you're the defendant, sometimes when you're the plaintiff in a lawsuit, you're in a money losing situation, no matter how well it turns out. There's something to be said where if someone hands you $50,000 immediately and you're done, versus years from now, you're going to get the right to try to collect $100,000. It comes back to making a good business decision, because that $50,000 handed to you easily, you're going to get back in business. You're not going to be spending attorney's fees. You're not going to be spending time. You're not going to be doing whatever. There is something to be said, and there's a value, and you want to talk about value of money over time. There's a value to doing that early than there is to doing it late. So it comes back to, existentially, I want to be vindicated. This person owes me $100,000, dead to rights, versus, how am I going to get that money back? So, a practical consequence is you're going to get that money back if you settle and they agree to pay, versus an existential question or an existential kind of result where I went and I got a judgment for the full amount, my attorney's fees, my costs, whatever, and I collected nothing. So, it's a little bit of both when you're evaluating lawsuits from both sides, from plaintiff and defendant side.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. And back to our emotional state, when we start the business and the partners and doing it right and getting the paperwork done and the reluctance to do that. The flip side to that, or in addition to that, I would say I counsel business owners all of the time that this is an unemotional endeavor. There's no emotion. It's hard to make money when you are acting on emotion. And so when someone gets one of these lawsuits, nuisance or otherwise, the reality is just try to get out of it, right or wrong. And it's very hard because, again, my generation grew up watching, Perry Mason come in and fix everything, in the span of 45 minutes, and it was all made right. And we're used to seeing these things on television, and the uninitiated may not understand what that reality is. And that's something that's very hard to do. What do you mean? He literally stole that money from me. Yeah, I know, but you got to let him have it, or it's going to cost you $100,000. And there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to go get it back. So you're going to spend the money that you lost. You might double your losses, and you were right, and you lost. So I think that my advice is to try to get yourself out of a lawsuit as fast as you can, generally speaking. Would you say that that is a prudent course of action, unless someone really wants to get out there and risk?
Yes. I mean, like I said, no matter what side you're on, particularly if you're the defendant, it's a time-losing and money-losing proposition. So you want to, extricate yourself from the money losing proposition as soon as possible, if possible. Sometimes, like I said, you got no choice, but if you have a choice, make a good choice.
What's a legal issue? Is there one that comes to mind that you see that could have been avoided not with paperwork and not with contracts, but with just a simple conversation early on? Is there something that stands out in your head, having worked with entrepreneurs as much as you have, that just said, if some guy sat down and just kind of had this conversation at the beginning, X might have been avoided?
A lot of lawsuits, incidents, disputes that I'm involved with, I mean, a lot of them could just be resolved with communication between the parties, and like objective communication and productive communication, not like I'm calling you up to, say I hate you and you're a bad guy, but like, putting the emotion aside and being like, look, we have a problem between us. Let's come up with a solution that both of us may not like, but we can live with. And I think that there's a lot of circumstances where before you bring in the attorneys or whatever and you have a lawsuit involved, particularly if it's two business affiliates or partners there's an issue or whatever, having like really frank, open, and truthful communication can avoid a lot of issues and a lot of business disputes.
Keep the friends out of it, keep the wives out of it, that sort of thing.
Keep your nephew who's an attorney in a different state out of it. Just have a, you don't want to say heart to heart, but have like a real conversation, not, and it don't have like some stupid text conversation or some stupid email chain that are all going to be exhibits in a lawsuit later on. Like have like a real life meeting with someone, or even on Zoom or, Microsoft Teams or whatever. Like have like a real communication, like a back and forth dynamic communication with someone. If you're serious about trying to resolve a situation, don't resort to, passive technology, because the message is going to get lost in translation and you're just going to look stupid, because years from now, this text message that you erratically sent out is now going to be, a jury is going to have to interpret what you meant when, you said F off to the person or whatever late at night or whatever. So, a real practical conversation. Yeah, I would encourage before any client does it. If you have an avenue to try to resolve something before we have to come in and like, whatever, try to do it.
Yeah. The use of passive technology. I had never heard of it put that way. I think let me ask you, what do you mean by passive technology?
Well, it's by passive technology, I mean by using a text message or an email to try to engage someone in a dispute situation or whatever. I mean, obviously you're actively doing it, but it's much more passive than having a productive interaction with someone, particularly, if we're not going to fight each other or, do something weird, if we can have like a face-to-face meeting, and actually do something, or even if we can't do a meeting, can we have a Zoom or something, or if we can't do a Zoom, we have a phone call versus, I'm just sending you electronic messages and you're sending me electronic messages best and forth, because like I said, it gets lost in translation and it doesn't have the same effect as if we're trying to real time actively communicate with each other back and forth.
Yeah, that's so good. I always say it's pretty basic, which is just make the phone call. Yeah. Just have the conversation. Just bring them. No, don't text that. In the world today, this is probably becoming more and more prevalent. So that's really good that you said that. And I have never really thought about it in those terms. You're just doing something that is passive aggressive that ultimately is going to come back and bite you, simply because it's easier to type out your rage message than it is to have a reasonable conversation with somebody sitting across from you. That's fantastic. Yeah,
it's true. And people get weirder and weirder with their messages too. I mean, people send like Facebook messages when they have like disputes, or like a message on Instagram or on LinkedIn or something. I mean, I've seen a lot of really weird, absurd communications between and among people where, like you were just talking about, if you just had a real conversation, you probably could have avoided something, but instead, I couldn't sleep at night. So I sent you some whacked out message on LinkedIn. And now 3 years later, I got a court reading it out loud in front of everyone, Right. So, I mean, it's just very simple, basic stuff. I mean, go back like it's the 70s or earlier or whatever, and just have a meeting with someone, and don't blow it up any bigger than it has to be either. Don't, show, and like you said, leave the wives and husbands out of it, and leave, your nephew from, a different state who practices. Just try to resolve it. And if not, then you tried your best. And if you got to go forward with the lawsuits, then you go forward.
I think that this last 6-7 minutes of conversation that we just had is the best legal advice I could give somebody as a non-attorney relative to really any kind of dispute. But since we're talking about entrepreneurs, I think that there is not a better bit of advice than the conversation you and I just had on this from my perspective, because I think the lack of those things or using those passive technologies, as you said, is the genesis of so much, because if you're not face to face with each other, it just gets easy to start raging. Let me move on to some legal myths versus realities from your perspective, just some real quick ones here, and you tell me what you think. The myth, or there's a saying, if it's not written down, it doesn't matter.
Myth, but hard reality to prove.
Good. Yeah. LLCs automatically protect you from from everything.
Myth.
Yeah, absolutely. You can always fix it later legally.
I would say myth. However, there's a lot you can fix subsequently.
Yeah, I agree. This is a question, straightforward. Lawsuits come up. Somebody's owed money. You broke a contract. This is kind of a myth or reality, but I want you to expand on this a little bit. This belief that lawsuits are always about money.
False. Not always about money. A lot of it's about principle, like we were talking about earlier. Sometimes, for like esoteric things, people, fight over stuff that's not just money, like legal concepts, like specific performance, trying to make someone do something or whatever. But there's also like the metaphysical portion you said, where there's a lot of like pride in, trying to prove your point and trying to be right versus wrong. So yeah, there's a lot of that in lawsuits too.
What part do attorneys and accountants play together, and do they always see eye to eye? Is it important that both sides see eye to eye for a business owner?
Well, attorneys and accountants are part of a team that should help businesses from before they're created through their entire life. I personally don't have disputes with accountants. I always yield to accountants when I deal with them, and I like dealing with accountants because they're generally smart people. They help businesses like I help businesses, and we want to, we both have the same goal, and we should both be on the same team. Some attorneys take a very adversarial role against accountants. Why? I don't know. Generally speaking, I always yield to the accountant when it comes time to make decisions about the business, because like you in the myth versus fact before, where you said you can always fix something legally, I said sometimes, because it's a lot easier to fix something legally than it is to fix something from an accounting or financial perspective. So, if you're going to start a business, go to your accountant first. I always encourage people to talk with their accountant over their personal finances and stuff, because we can, you come to me, we can start a corporation, we can start an LLC, we can start a lot of things. But financially speaking, if you have certain assets or things titled certain ways or whatever, and you form the wrong business organization, you're going to get killed when it's tax season, versus if you went to your accountant's like, oh, because you have like a family limited partnership or a family trust or something like that, you should have X instead of Y. So when an accountant tells me that, I'm like, okay, then we'll go X instead of Y, and I'll set it up that way. So I always work with accountants. Some attorneys don't. I don't understand why. Some accountants are also, cool and very easy to work with whenever. And some also take the same thing as attorneys, where they're, they just can't play nice with attorneys. So I always try to work with the accountants, and I always yield to the accountants, and that's the best practice. Because like I said, fixing stuff from an accounting standpoint, much harder than to fix stuff from a legal standpoint.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that just to put my own 2 cents in on it, that if your accountant and your attorney don't talk, don't know who each other is, and don't get along, you need to find a new accountant or a new attorney, because I think that's critical, particularly at scale. You get to any reasonable size. I think that that's very important. So yeah, I don't disagree. A lot of these questions I'm asking are things that come up as I've worked with so many entrepreneurs, and I always say that there are no stupid questions, just people too stupid to ask them. So some of these are very rudimentary questions, but have come up over my 30 odd years in business, and I try to put them together for you to give us an answer. So some of these might seem pretty rudimentary, but I think you probably have enough experience to understand that there is a lot of misunderstanding in the entrepreneurial world about lawsuits and about what part attorneys play and how important they are. So in that context, some of this we've covered, but I'm going to ask you these anyway. Handshake deals, are they smart or stupid?
Stupid.
Yeah, it's no enforcing that, right?
I don't even need to comment on that. Stupid.
That's right. Like I said, the most dangerous sentence a business owner would say to an attorney or a lawyer.
I've done some research on myself. I would like you to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, right.
Particularly now with the rise of AI. So
yeah,
I'll
that's a
listen
good
to
one.
what you have to say, but I'm the attorney. You're not. So
I didn't think about that. So in those we talked a lot about contracts earlier. Is there one clause? Is there one part of a contract that, because we all get them and there's, multiple pages and all that. Is there one clause that business owners never read, don't pay that much attention to, but should?
Sure. The dispute resolution provision in the contract that says what happens when, it goes down and we got to go figure out how we're going to resolve the situation, because if it's got like an alternative dispute resolution provision, you're not going to like it. And if it's got a venue provision that's not where you are, you're not going to like it. And it should have a reciprocal attorney's fee clause for the prevailing party. So those are all things that a lot of people just take for granted and overlook. Being involved in arbitration there's a lot of out-of-pocket costs that you have to pay for that you don't have to pay for in a lawsuit. Same thing with mediation, particularly pre-suit mediation, because if you don't settle, you're going to have to file a lawsuit anyways. And then the same thing with venue. If you agree to a stupid venue, then you're stuck with it. And, if you're in Florida and you have a Montana venue, guess what? You better pack your stuff. You're going to Bozeman. So make sure you always check that. And like I said, negotiate the terms. And if they don't want to negotiate the terms, maybe you don't sign the contract.
That was, as we wind down here, that was my next question. Real quick, give us that difference and why that's important. Mediation, arbitration versus going to court.
Sure. So mediation is just a voluntary process where two parties get together with an impartial mediator. The mediator doesn't make any finding of fact determinations of law and shouldn't comment on how great or how crappy your case is. They just get the two parties together, on Zoom, in person, whatever, and try to get them to voluntarily agree to a settlement. And it's all totally voluntary, all totally, confidential. Either you agree to a settlement or you don't. No one makes you do anything. Court is just like what we've been talking about, litigation. You go to court, there's a plaintiff, there's a defendant, maybe there's a counterclaim, there's a judge, or there's a jury, depending on if you waive the jury or ask for the jury. And, there's a timeline. The judge is free. Okay, keep that in mind. Arbitration is private alternative dispute resolution, where the arbitrator is the private judge, and it's either one or three. It's a panel or it's one, and it's run by an organization. So there's a lot, and depending on what you're arbitrating, there's a lot of regulatory or arbitration organizations out there. And you have to pay for the arbitrator, you have to pay for the arbitration, and you have to pay your attorneys, and you have to essentially, it's like having a court case, but it's in private, not in public. And the arbitrator makes the decisions. The arbitrator says who's the winner or the loser. And then ultimately you get an arbitration award, which is just a piece of paper. You have to take the arbitration award anyways and take it to court and get it confirmed into a judgment. So even if you're arbitrating, unless the other side agrees to pay you the award or whatever, you still have to go to court anyways. When I just said free judge, litigation, the judge is free. Arbitration, the arbitrator is not free. The arbitrator costs a lot of money. So if you have an arbitration provision, it's going to be quite costly because it's all the same expenses from court, except instead of the judge is free, the judge costs a lot of money, and the judge is the arbitrator.
My advice on that is not only push mediation and embrace mediation as hard as you can, but find a really good mediator. And there is a big difference between good mediators and bad mediators.
Yes, mediation is very personality driven. And as a rule in my practice, I only use former judges as mediators
Yep.
because they do, in my opinion, again, just my opinion, but they do a much better job than like an active practicing attorney or a retired attorney, because they have the acumen and the mentality of, sometimes there's not always a winner or a loser, or sometimes there has to be a winner or a loser. And they try to convey that during the course of mediation, and they understand dispute resolution, whatever, but they understand it from a truly objective standpoint, not trying to do whatever. If you have a mediator who's not a great mediator, or someone who is like a plaintiff's counsel most of the time, or someone who's an insurance defense attorney most of the time, as much as they're supposed to be impartial or whatever, somewhere deep in their subconscious is their insurance defense mindset or their plaintiff mindset or whatever. And that's always going to affect your mediation at some level, whatever metaphysical level you think it's going to happen or not. So always use a good mediator, always try to use a former judge.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Matthew, really appreciate the conversation. How can people get a hold of you if they have questions, if they want to talk about this more? Is that something that you are encouraging them to do? I know that you are at Fornaro Legal, Fornaro, FornaroLegal.com, so people can find you there. We, of course, will put that in the show notes. How else can people get a hold of you?
Sure, Jerry. So the best way actually is to go to FornaroLegal.com, because it's got all my contact info, all my social media on there, all my massive amount of blog posts, white papers, podcasts, videos. It's got a lot of information in there that answers a lot of your questions. But if you have any questions, whatever, just email me or call me. I'm glad to help you out. We were talking beforehand, before we started up the segment. We like helping young entrepreneurs, old entrepreneurs, whatever it is. I just like helping people in business succeed and focus on their business, as opposed to having to focus on collateral matters like legal issues. So,
yeah, and I would say to everyone listening, I would bookmark his website. Having spent a little bit of time there, to me, it looks like it is worth keeping and referencing. As he said, I'm sure he's happy to take a conversation, but you can really learn a lot from people who have gone through it and who have done it. And this is the important stuff, people. Believe me, this planning in the beginning will save you huge at the end. Be an adult about it. Don't be emotional about it. It's not, you got to plan for the worst and hope for the best, I guess. And that's a perfect example for why that phrase even exists, is for entrepreneurs. But really, Matthew, I think we really, a lot of dumb questions. I appreciate you taking them, but I think that there is, a lot of us are just people out and we just jump and we just go without any kind of understanding outside of what we watch on television. Like I keep saying, how the attorney world or how the legal world works. So I appreciate you coming on and putting up with me for an hour with some of these dumb questions.
No, Joe, I appreciate it. There's such thing as dumb questions. There's a thing as a dumb question, particularly in business, because it's your livelihood. So you got to make sure you get the answer.
That's right. Exactly. I appreciate it. Thank you, sir.